Picture this. It's the year 627 CE. You've got the largest military coalition ever assembled in the history of Arabia, and they are marching straight toward Medina. Their one goal? Absolute destruction of the young Muslim community. So in this explainer, we're going to dive right into the Battle of the Trench, also known as Ghazwat al-Khandaq. We'll see how a single, unprecedented defensive strategy literally rewrote the rules of Arabian warfare and saved a city from being wiped off the map. The defenders were staring down a massive Confederate army of 10,000 men. And we're not just talking about one rival tribe here. This was a sprawling, highly organized alliance. You had the Quraysh of Mecca, led by Abu Sufyan, teaming up with nomadic Arab tribes like the Ghatafan, and even Jewish tribes like the previously exiled Banu Nadir. Oh, and they didn't travel light. They brought 600 horses and 3,000 camels. I mean, just think about the sheer logistics of that for a second. Trying to move, let alone feed, an army and thousands of animals in the middle of the desert, that was a terrifying, undeniable display of wealth and raw power, all unified by that single goal: exterminating the Muslims. Now, the contrast here is just staggering. Inside the city, the defenders were vastly outmanned, fielding an army of only 3,000 men. That is a devastating numerical disadvantage. Look, by any conventional military metric of 7th century Arabia, the defenders inside Medina should have been easily and quickly crushed. But, as you're going to see, survival isn't always about numbers. It's really about strategy, extreme discipline, and absolute unity. To really understand the tension here, we have to rewind a bit and look at the state of Arabia after the Battle of Uhud. You see, we can't view the Battle of the Trench in a vacuum. It's the direct climax of this fierce, ongoing struggle for survival in the Hijaz region. Early Islamic historians like Ibn Ishaq point out that the Muslims' major victory at Badr was quickly followed by a really painful setback at Uhud. At Uhud, Muslim archers actually abandoned their posts, which allowed the brilliant military commander Khalid ibn al-Walid to outflank them. So the Quraysh claimed a minor victory there, but they failed to actually eliminate the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, which meant they were always going to come back. And 2 years later, they returned with overwhelming force. So, how do you defend against an unstoppable force? Let's talk about the trench strategy. First off, the geography of Medina itself played a massive role in their survival. The city was actually naturally fortified. On 3 sides, the east, west, and south, it was protected by this incredibly rough terrain, sharp, jagged volcanic rocks, and really dense palm groves. It was virtually impassable for a massive army, and basically a nightmare for cavalry. The only real vulnerability? That was an open gap to the north. Facing this seemingly impossible situation, the Prophet Muhammad did something crucial. He opened the floor to new ideas. This is a vital leadership principle known as shura, or consultation. And during this consultation, a companion named Salman al-Farsi suggested something completely unheard of. Salman was Persian, and he brought with him military knowledge from the Sasanian Empire. He proposed digging a massive defensive trench right across that exposed northern gap. You have to realize, for local tribes who were completely accustomed to rapid hit-and-run cavalry charges, this was a totally revolutionary, foreign concept. And that contrast is the absolute game-changer here. The Quraysh relied heavily on devastating, open-field cavalry charges, exactly what they used so effectively at Uhud. But by adopting this Sasanian trench technique, the Muslims completely shifted the paradigm. They chose not to meet the enemy in the open desert, and by doing that, they instantly neutralized the Quraysh's greatest assets, their massive numerical superiority and their fast-moving horses. But coming up with the idea is one thing. Executing it is another. Driven by pure desperation and urgency, the defenders pulled off a staggering engineering marvel. They dug a trench, 5.5 kilometers long, 9 meters wide, and 4.5 meters deep, in just 6 grueling days. Just picture this, 3,000 men divided into small teams of 25, digging day and night. And they were starving. Historical sources tell us the hunger was so intense that early traditions even record the Prophet himself tying a stone to his stomach just to suppress the hunger pangs. Yet through this incredible unity and shared sacrifice, they quite literally moved the earth to seal the city.
And they finished just in time. This brings us to the actual siege of Medina. So this massive Confederate army finally arrives. They're expecting an easy slaughter, right? But they're stopped dead in their tracks, completely baffled. They were geared up for an open battle, but suddenly there's this massive ditch in the way, and their cavalry is completely useless. Now, remember what we said about logistics. Assembling 10,000 men is impressive, sure, but suddenly being forced into a prolonged siege? Feeding all those men and thousands of horses in a barren desert for a month? It was an absolute logistical nightmare that the Quraysh simply had not planned for. Slowly but surely, their animals suffered and morale began to chip away.
But things were just as tense inside the city. To hold that line, the Prophet had to implement an incredibly strict surveillance system. Out of the 3,000 men, only about 1,500 were actively guarding that massive 5.5-kilometer stretch at any given time. The urgency was intensely claustrophobic. There was zero room for error. They used a rapid four-stage surveillance strategy, dividing warriors into small groups to guard the trench around the clock. If even a single segment was left unattended, the enemy could fill a section or force a crossing, and the whole city would fall. And that almost happened. The tension completely boiled over when a renowned Quraysh champion named Umar ibn Abdwad actually managed to cross a narrow, vulnerable section of the trench. This guy was a legendary fighter, historically considered equal to 1,000 men in battle, and he's standing there, loudly challenging the Muslims. The Prophet's cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, stepped forward to meet him. What followed was a fierce, dust-clouded, one-on-one duel, and Ali emerged victorious. This wasn't just a physical win, it was a devastating psychological blow that sent the attackers scrambling back in a panic.
But the physical trench wasn't the only battleground. That leads us to betrayal and psychological warfare.
Actually, the greatest existential threat during this siege didn't even come from across the trench. It came from right in their own backyard. Detailed accounts from early historians like al-Waqidi explain that the Jewish tribe Banu Qurayza, who lived in the southern part of Medina, were persuaded to break their defensive pact with the Muslims. The leader of the exiled Banu Nadir, Huyay ibn Akhtab, essentially infiltrated their stronghold and relentlessly pressured them until they tore up the mutual constitution they had signed. So suddenly, the Muslims aren't just facing 10,000 men to the north, they are now completely surrounded, with a heavily armed internal enemy threatening their families to the south. To really understand the dread of this moment, we look to the Islamic tradition. Surah Al-Ahzab in the Quran paints an incredibly vivid, terrifying picture of what the defenders felt. They were exhausted, freezing, starving, and now suddenly betrayed. The text says their eyes grew wild and hearts reached the throats. It respectfully frames this entire ordeal not just as a terrifying physical peril, but as the ultimate spiritual trial, a moment that separated the true believers from those who wavered or acted as hypocrites in the face of annihilation. To survive this absolute nightmare, the Muslims deployed a masterclass in psychological warfare. A man named Nuaym ibn Masud had secretly accepted Islam, and the Prophet instructed him to use deception to break the enemy alliance. Nuaym went to both the Quraysh and the Banu Qurayza and systematically planted seeds of doubt. He fed them conflicting yet highly plausible stories. He told the Banu Qurayza to demand hostages from the Quraysh before attacking. Then he went to the Quraysh and warned them that the Banu Qurayza were planning to take hostages and hand them over to the Muslims. It worked perfectly. When the Quraysh asked for a joint attack, Banu Qurayza demanded the hostages, just as Nuaym warned. The alliance instantly dissolved into total paranoia and mistrust. Which brings us to the climax and the final withdrawal. So the alliance is fractured from the inside, morale is hitting rock bottom, and then nature itself delivers the final blow. The month-long siege had pushed everyone to the brink, and then a devastating winter windstorm tore across the desert. Islamic sources heavily recognize this as direct divine intervention. Freezing, violent winds uprooted the enemy tents, blew out their campfires, and essentially made survival impossible for the starving, divided coalition. Abu Sufyan looked around, realized the siege was a complete and catastrophic failure, and finally ordered a full retreat back to Mecca. Let's look at the consequences and the lasting legacy of this incredible event. The sudden, total collapse of the greatest army Arabia had ever seen changed the region forever. The Confederates had thrown literally everything they had at Medina, and they failed. This victory permanently neutralized the Quraysh military threat, it led to the surrender of Banu Qurayza, and it firmly consolidated Muslim authority in Medina. The balance of power had decisively shifted, and this cleared the path for future diplomatic milestones, like the famous Treaty of Hudaybiyah. When we look back at the Battle of the Trench, it leaves us with some really profound historical and spiritual takeaways. It's a testament to how adaptability, shared consultation, and unwavering resilience can break an invincible enemy. The Prophet's willingness to listen and adopt a foreign Persian idea, the incredible discipline of the defenders, and that brilliant use of psychological warfare, it makes this one of the most studied engagements in early Islamic history by both modern academics and traditional scholars. It's absolute proof that military wisdom really has no borders. And all of this leaves us with a really provocative question.
How often do we just rely on sheer force when strategic ingenuity and absolute unity are actually the true keys to survival? When you're faced with overwhelming challenges, whether they're literal or figurative, the lessons of the trench, preparation, open consultation, and holding the line together, they remained just as relevant today as they were back in the 7th century. Something to really think about. Until next time, keep exploring the history that shaped our world.